Good. Can everyone hear me? Thank you for being here on this evening. It's great. Thank you for the invitation to have me come. Let me just make sure I know how to work the slides. Yes, I do. Good. So what I have to say will be a little bit, I think, redundant with what Nathan talked to you about. Let me see if I can make this bigger, though. I'm sorry, I can't see my slides here in this mode. Sorry, I'm going to have to. You couldn't figure out how to do that? Okay, well, if Nathan couldn't figure it out, then I'm, well, okay, let me give it one.
Is it on presenter view?
It is on presenter view, but yeah, that's what I was doing there. Tell you what. Good enough. Okay. Will be a little bit redundant, I think, but hopefully not too, or some good built-in redundancy might be helpful in covering this ground again and making sense of it all and thinking about children's development and the development of children's brains. So are people familiar with brain training, working memory training? You may see these games online. Nintendo has them, Lumosity. You know, all of these things. Life is brain training, right? The brain is responding to experience, as Professor Fox pointed out, and developing very early, right from the start, and in ways that are appropriate for the environment in which development's occurring, right? And so we need to keep that in mind. I think just that simple statement is just worth pondering over, right? So the brain's going to develop in response to experience in ways that are appropriate for the context in which the brain is situated, right, in response to experience over time. And so when we know that children are growing up in adverse environments, it's going to have effects on the brain, it's going to have effects on behavior that are appropriate for that context. However, that may not match with sort of our general goals for children as we think about these general things, right? We know that the effects of experiences, as we heard before, the effects of parenting and family, effects of neighborhoods, schools, and communities. And this idea here that the way in which the context in child development takes place will really shape development over time. And so we've learned a lot about that. I want to share some of that with you and talk a little bit about the research that my colleagues and I have been doing, studying this idea that the brain, which we're really looking at through physiology, more than so directly looking at the brain through EEG or MRI, but making an inference about the brain from the development of cognition and some other indicators, right? And so this idea that we can understand this, we have begun to understand this process quite well, and that has implications for the kinds of experiences we want to try to provide children to recover from adverse experience and try to understand the limits of plasticity and malleability. That was a great question that we had before. So what are these sort of general goals for children? I think one way to think about these general goals is through this term self-regulation, right? So we want kids to be able to take initiative, right, and get out there and go, but also to be compliant when we need them to, right? We want them to be emotionally exuberant and expressive and engaged, but then to be able to stop when we ask them to, right? That's a very important skill. As we know that as teachers and parents, we experience that all the time. And to sustain attention and to focus, but then stop doing that. Go play, go do something else, go be rambunctious, those sorts of things. And to interact socially with other children and adults, right? And to become conscientious and to become focused in their activities. And really, we can lump these under this sort of self-regulation idea. It's more than just self-control. It's more than just the ability to stop doing something and be compliant, but to understand it. Right? Those are our goals for children, to be willing partners in association with us, as their parents, as adults, as their friends, as their teachers, and so on and so forth. So what is this self-regulation, and how does it develop? Well, we've learned quite a bit about that, right? At first, it emerges, of course, from other regulation, from warm, sensitive interactions with caregivers. Those are essential, as Professor Fox pointed out. The serve and return, it has to be there. And we see that these are actually nice examples here. I just pulled them off Google, images, but we've got the loving, we've got the interchange there. We have this sort of watchful scaffolding in the lower, your left-hand corner. And here, dads are important too. We can't forget about that, right? They're in there also. But these warm, sensitive interactions, what they're providing children, they're helping children regulate, right? Parents help children regulate body temperature, physiology, feeding, right? Sleeping, those sorts of things. Those are foundational. From that, you're going to build to other, regulating emotion, regulating attention, right? Those are very, very important things. Joint attention, scaffolded attention is what's going on here. That's moving away from that basic physiological regulating temperature, body, sleep, and so on and so forth, to more regulation of emotion, regulation of attention. And that's very important, right? Because the regulation of attention and emotion and physiology set the stage for the development of these executive functions that we've been talking about. So children, of course, we know right from the get-go are paying attention, right? So infant attention is a fascinating window into children's development, right? And it's very interesting. You may be familiar with this research, right? This is called this violation of expectation paradigm. So the idea here is what will happen is the child will be attending, and children will look longer, infants will look longer at novel events, at things that are new, right? You show them something, a pattern or something, infants will habituate to it. You put a new one up, they'll spend more time looking at the new one than at the old one. It's just sort of novelty preference. It's a great thing. Well, some enterprising child development researchers realized they could, make hay with this paradigm. And so what they did was they presented children expected and unexpected events. And this is a mathematics one, right? So the hand comes in, it puts an object in the case, the screen comes up, I'm focusing on the top one, a second object's added, and then the hand leaves empty. So how many things should be behind there when the screen goes down? There should be 2 there. Did everybody follow me on that? It's simple math. We got it, right? But if you have a confederate under the table, which is what psychologists like to do, right? They'll hang out under the table and take one away just to mess with you. And so when they do that and they mess with the child and the screen comes down, there's only one, children will reliably, at 3 months of age, at 6 months of age, look reliably longer at that unexpected event. That shouldn't be that way. What is that? Why is there only one there? And so, as you can imagine, once we found this out, researchers have done this again and again and again with math, with physical objects, physical properties. And the idea, we don't know exactly what's going on, but is it the infant's reasoning about this stuff? No, the infant's not reasoning about it. But the brain is tuning into regularities. It's tuning into regularities. As the brain learns language, it's tuning into regularities. Statistical probabilities is what the brain is doing early on. And so we can see that attention is going to be so very important as we seem to be, I missed my little gag, the slide comes up. It's as if the child is surprised by this event. Of course, surprise, it's a complicated emotion. We don't want to say that the children at that age necessarily are surprised by these things, but the violation of expectation is powerful. It clues us into the importance of attention and that children are attending up and running early in life. And that's certainly an essential goal of early care, is to scaffold and support children's attention. The other thing is to scaffold and support children's ability to regulate their emotion, because this is the other system that's up and running right from the start, right? It's the main form of communication in infancy is through emotion and emotional responses. And children have ways of regulating their emotion on their own, but they need support for that as well. So we have some, again, from Google Image, some nice examples of this with self-soothing, proximity to the caregiver, the mother, or with a plush toy here, right? But unregulated emotion can lead to problems with attention, can lead to problems with physiology. If children don't learn to regulate emotion, so regulating attention, regulating emotion are fundamental building blocks for self-regulation, for becoming an active, purposeful, intentional little being that we talked about at the beginning with the goals for children's development. And then finally, there's of course a physiological substrate, and this is where the brain part starts to creep in, right? So we're looking at attention, we're looking at emotion, and what happens when you have an emotional response or you become very interested in something. What does your heart do? It beats a little faster, right? Your breathing maybe respiration increases, so on and so forth. If it continues for a time, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis will kick in. That's not a bad thing, right? Your HPA axis will kick in, right? So these stress hormones, which will be produced, and stress not as a bad word or not something to be avoided, but under moderate stress, mild stress, these stress hormones will kick in. So regulating attention, regulating emotion, regulating stress physiology. Super important because of everything that Professor Fox told you about the effects of these stress hormones on the brain and on brain development. They are a fundamental neuromodulator, right? They will affect activity in the brain, and they'll affect the way the brain wires up in response to experience over time. So if an infant, a young child, is in a caregiving relationship in which it's getting support, he or she's getting support for the regulation of emotion and the regulation of attention, there'll be a physiological regulation that goes along with it. And the idea is that the brain will begin to wire up in response to this process of self-regulation. The system will become a self-regulating system. But if the child is under adverse circumstances and adverse conditions, those stress hormones may rise to levels that are really uncoupled from attention and really uncoupled from emotion, and can rise to levels in which they'll start to preferentially shape the brain to make it more reactive and less reflective or responsive to stimulation. And that's the idea. That's what we're thinking about when we say early experience is helping to set the stage for executive function development, right? So the executive functions are associated with prefrontal cortex here, right? Above the eyebrows, behind the forehead. And this is a slower developing part of the brain. And the idea is that progress in physiological, emotional, attentional development should be good indicators of executive function development. And guess what? They really are. We have a lot of data to suggest this. So these executive functions, as we know, are working memory, inhibitory control. They're reflective capacity, the ability to reflect on experience, hold multiple things in mind, right, to inhibit, but to understand the reason for inhibiting or resisting distraction and so on and so forth. And as we know, they're very important for school readiness. They're very, in fact, I like to say that really executive functions and self-regulation, that is school readiness, right? Why do kids start school around age 6, age 5, age 6? Because prefrontal cortex is maturing enough to control attention, to control emotional responses. Ask a kindergarten teacher what he or she wants to see in a child. It's that. Control your behavior. You can sit still, pay attention, be curious, be enthusiastic, use your words, use language. Those sorts of things are very important. And that's what teachers say, kindergarten teachers say with this. So the idea here is that when we're talking about self-regulation, we're talking about the development of this system, relations among physiological aspects of experience, emotional, attentional, cognitive aspects of experience. And these are all integrated now. As we heard before, we used to study them separately. That's no fun. You know, we want to study how they go together, how they develop together over time in response to experience. It's very helpful, right? And here, as I said, the executive functions include this working memory, so on and so forth. We don't need to go over that anymore, but they're important for planning and problem solving, but also important for regulating emotion. Now, there are many ways in which we regulate emotion, but certainly executive functions, being able to distract ourselves, to move our attention away from something that's bothering us, to use strategies, those sorts of things are very important, and that's what we try to convey to children, right? Stop thinking about it. Stop doing that. Get away from there. Don't, those sorts of things, and the way we want to help children with this process, right? So let me just show you in case, I think the best way to learn about executive functions, if you're less familiar with it, is to do some executive function tasks yourself, right? It's very helpful. So you can imagine this. We can all do it as a group if we want. But this is a very simple one, developed by a psychologist in the Soviet Union, Alexander Luria, who's a godfather of neuropsychology, basically. And he was studying largely veterans returning from the Second World War, right? The soldiers of Russia who had gone and fought and defeated Hitler's armies, and coming back and seeing traumatic brain injury in many of these soldiers. And soldiers with damage to prefrontal cortex were unable to do this very simple task. It's Luria's peg tapping task. It's a very good assessment of prefrontal cortex function and executive function. And it's quite simply, when I tap one time, you tap two times, okay? And when I tap two times, you tap one time. Got it? So if we did that, right, if I tap one time, you tap 2 times, I tap 2 times. Okay, ready? Okay. Yeah, you blew it. Out of the pool. It's a great task that way. It works very well. No 3-year-old can do this one, right? And really, basically, all 5-year-olds can, except for you, right? And so, in that way, it's really good around age 4 and a half. They'll hang in there with you for a little while. They'll do some of the early tasks, but then it's just like the rule evaporates, and you look at them and they're just tapping right back at you. Yeah, okay, great. Good job. You're working really hard at doing my peg tapping task, right? So this is a good one for that. And then that's the sort of working memory and inhibitory control. Need to hold on to the rule and then execute, right? And that's the idea with working memory. And I think this one works so well because it's motoric and it's auditory. You hear that tap one time, you're just going to tap. You're just imitation. It's just going to kick in. And you need to resist that is the thing that's most important for this type of task. And then another one that we use, this was developed by Phil Zalazzo and his student Sophie Jacques, who Phil's a professor at the University of Minnesota, developed a very nice executive function measure for young children called the dimensional change card sort. It's the workhorse measure, really, of executive function for 4-year-olds. This is like this. It says, here, show me 2 things that are alike on this page. Show me 2 things that go together. And almost invariably, kids will point to the 2 teapots. It's really salient. There are two teapots there. That's right. That's good. Those things are alike. Those go together. Now show me 2 things that are alike on this page, but in a different way. Show me 2 things that are alike in a new way. And the idea here is you need a shift from the dimension of shape to the dimension of... So, thank you. Good. And so we go through about 16 trials like this. And this is the sort of flexibility. That's the kind of cognitive flexibility, attention shift. So these are imperfect, measures or markers of what we want to see in children, but they're really good indicators of sort of the progress of prefrontal cortex development, is what we think. And they're responsive to emotion and stress. And so executive function, it's a tricky thing to measure, because if you didn't sleep well or you're angry or, if we get a child out of a classroom and he was just, in an argument with someone, not having the best day, not going to do very well on executive function tasks. We come back tomorrow and he's had a good night's sleep and he's just doing great. He's going to do a lot better. She's going to do a lot better on executive function tests. So the retest reliability of these things is tricky, but it's important consideration because it's such an important skill, I think, and such a sort of good indicator. But I think in many ways it's like the canary in the coal mine. Right? We want to check in on kids' attention. We want to check in on their emotional development. We want to check in on their physiological development for the reasons that these will support executive functions over time. But we need to understand sometimes those executive functions aren't going to be there. We've all been around young children on bad days. They're just not going to be there. But we want to maximize the good days and the ability to begin to regulate the physiology, attention in ways that support rather than undercut executive functions. Right? So here's another one. This is just sort of a working memory task. To hold on to 2 pieces of information. What color's in this house? What animal's in this house? What animal is in this house? What color? What animal? What color? What animal? So on and so forth. So we can increase that so that those tasks that I talked to you about before, they work well with 4-year-olds, but 3s can't do them and 5-year-olds can. We want something that's scalable so that we can measure executive functions longitudinally, use each person as his or her own control in longitudinal research to chart the progress. And this is the kind of task that we're using to do that. And you might just be interested to know that if we make the dog blue and the bird red, it's a much harder task. Kids have much more difficulty separating. It's called binding the stimulus property. So a little bit of psychological trivia wisdom for you on that. So the idea is, of course, that these executive functions are associated with prefrontal cortex, right? And they're dependent on, in action, right, in vivo, dependent on levels of moderate increases in stress hormones, primarily norepinephrine and dopamine, but also glucocorticoid hormone cortisol, right? And it has to do with the receptors in this area of the brain. And it will actually cause synaptic long-term potentiation. So it'll get the cells to fire, and they'll connect to the cells that they're adjacent to, and it'll begin to wire up if there's a moderate amount of stimulation, a moderate amount of increase in norepinephrine or dopamine. But if it's too high, it will actually shut the process down. It will shut the synaptic activity down. It will be synaptic long-term depression instead of potentiation. And this is the work of Amy Arnston and Patricia Goldman-Merkeach at Yale University. They've shown this in non-human primates doing single-unit recording of neurons in the prefrontal cortex. This is very interesting. The analogy is loosely like an internal combustion engine. If you, well, our cars are idiot-proof now, but those of us old enough will remember if you push the gas too hard in your car and you got too much gasoline in the cylinder head, it wouldn't fire. You flooded your engine out, right? You need the exact right mixture of air and gas for it to ignite in the cylinder head. Kind of the same thing in your prefrontal cortex when you talk about dopamine, levels of norepinephrine. So we're very interested in children's ability to regulate emotionally, attentionally, and physiologically because of this idea. This is the basis for understanding the development of prefrontal cortex and the relation of brain to behavior, brain development to behavior. Right, and essentially we're just talking about this circuitry here, right? So here's I don't have a pointer, but if you're familiar with your brain anatomy, in the bottom there, right, the blue structure is the amygdala, and the hippocampus is right behind that. And its experience is registered very rapidly there, right, preconsciously. And when experience is registered there, it produces this cascade of stress physiology, autonomic outflow, heart rate, increased heart rate, and kicking in the HPA axis. But at the same time, it's producing, through corticotropin-releasing hormone, increases in norepinephrine and dopamine that feed forward through that red structure, the anterior cingulate cortex, to prefrontal cortex. Hey, something's going on here. Should we engage executive functions? Yes, we should. It will feed back on and try to keep that at an optimal level of arousal. But what happens when the stimulation's too high and too prolonged? It's going to short circuit that, right? So we're really interested in the development of that circuitry in the brain in young children over time because of its importance for executive function, because of its importance for, I would say, school readiness. Right? And this follows this nice inverted U-shaped curve, if you're familiar with that, right? The Yerkes-Dodson law, the idea that a little bit of stress is a good thing for complex learning, right? It's very different from simple learning and fear conditioning or reactivity. And the idea is, so as experience is helping the child, right, as a supportive environment's helping the child to regulate emotion and attention and physiology, it's helping the child learn to stay at the top of that curve, to not be too bored at that end, the far left end, or too stressed out, the far right end here. That's sort of a simple way of thinking about it. But it works. I think it's effective. And then, of course, this prefrontal cortex is a slow developing area of the brain, so there potentially is time for plasticity and remodeling to occur. We don't have to panic, oh no, right? We're age 4.5 and we can't do peg tapping. There's hope yet, right? For most of us, I think. And then, of course, they say the prefrontal cortex is the slowest area of the brain. It doesn't reach full maturity until about age 20, 21, The brain's developing all the time. It goes up and then it just goes right back down is the problem for a prefrontal cortex, right? And so we're not talking about gerontology and cognitive aging, but these are some of the deficits that we experience as you get to be my age and a little older in terms of this, the working memory problems and those sorts of things. It's the flip side of this. So sort of last in, first out is the idea with brain development and cognitive abilities with this, right? So as I said before, they're essential for school readiness and school achievement, right? And they seem to be. We have, I think, increasingly good evidence that poverty is physiologically stressful for children, and that it's probably a primary mechanism for the school readiness gap that we see, because when kids start kindergarten, they're already behind when they come from poverty homes. So what can we do about it, and how can we best support the system? So use this sort of neuroscientifically informed approach to understand why helping kids regulate emotion and attention and physiology and a little bit of stress, learn to handle stress, is a good thing. And I think there are a couple of sort of things that we can do about it, people have looked at this, right? So there are studies that demonstrate the effects of poverty on child stress physiology, and partly through this mechanism on school readiness. One of ours is a longitudinal study known as the Family Life Project, which is a longitudinal study. It's called a NIH federally funded program project grant. And it's similar to, if you're familiar with here in Memphis, the Candle study. We've been following a group of families and children from birth. And they live in rural communities, small town, you can think of it in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. We started it when I was a professor there. So we've been collecting data in the home through home visits at these time points, 7 months of age through 60 months of age, measuring parenting and family ecology. And my part of the project's, of course, focused on emotion and stress physiology and executive functions. And we have genetic data. I won't talk any about that tonight. But the importance of these kind of studies for helping us understand development, right? And then I'll talk about some experimental stuff. But we always collect saliva, so we're looking at stress hormones through saliva in the children and in the mothers, by the way. It's less talked about, but we should probably study stress in the mothers. We should probably study it in the kids' teachers as well. Teachers often volunteer to give saliva samples in the studies that we run. I haven't been able to take them up on it yet, but I plan to one of these days. So we're looking at cortisol in response to these sort of emotion challenges, so the child's ability to regulate emotion. And what we find basically is that when kids are in these chaotic households, sort of the stress levels are high. This is a measure of cortisol from saliva from 7 months to 48 months. That dashed line is children's in high chaos homes, and their stress physiology is elevated. You want to be able to turn it on, so you want it low when you need it, but then you want it to go away. And the idea here is this concept of allostasis, it's called. It's sort of like turning the thermostat on in your house and leaving it on because you think it might be cold. You just don't know what the weather's going to be like. But eventually your house will burn down, but you'll be warm. That's the important thing. And then what we looked at, the extent to which, so measuring parenting and measuring this cortisol, and the extent to which this would go together, kids' ability to regulate emotion, their high-quality parenting. And sure enough, it was related to lower cortisol levels in these children, age 7, 15, and 24 months, and to executive function, but not to IQ. And really, I think self-regulation is more important than intelligence. It's more important than IQ for a child's development, because we don't really know what IQ is to begin with anyway. We know that it's measured well. But self-regulation, we have a much better understanding of this and where this is instantiated in the brain and how it works physiologically and all of those things. So this was gratifying to see to a certain extent. And then, right, I won't even, this is going to be redundant. This study, I think it made a big impression on all of us as psychologists, this longitudinal study from Dunedin, New Zealand. So another shout out for the value of longitudinal research, in which they found that, as Professor Fox showed you before, relations between self-regulation and early childhood, and in that study they were measuring it between really age 3 and age 11, but related to adult outcomes at age 32. And almost any outcome you throw in there, they're seeing this relationship. And this is controlling for IQ and SES. So they made a number of manipulations in the data analysis. They took out the lowest, they took out the highest, they controlled for IQ, they controlled for SES. Every time self-regulation showed up in these analyses in much the same way.
What's SES?
Oh, sorry, socioeconomic status, so poverty status, yeah. All right, so what can we do about it, right? We see this, can we support children's self-regulation with the idea that it's going to support brain development in healthy ways, in appropriate ways? And the answer, I think, is encouragingly yes. So there's some randomized controlled trials. This is one by a colleague at NYU, Sibel Raver is her name. She was a professor at the University of Chicago at the time that she did this. It's called the Chicago School Readiness Project. And these were in Head Start programs in inner city Chicago that were basically just derailed by child behavior problems. That's kind of all they were doing all day long, was trying to help kids to calm down. Kids from very stressed out homes, from very, very disadvantaged homes. And what the teachers needed a break. They needed a mental health consultant, and they needed coaching to come into the classroom. And that's what the Chicago School Readiness Project provided, right? And the idea would be, it would improve the emotional climate of the classroom, it would lower these levels of child conflict with peers, and it would lower teacher stress. And it should relate to increases in self-regulation. Kids' executive function should get better, and learning should increase. And guess what? It was a randomized controlled trial, so a true experiment with randomization at the classroom level, and sure enough, that's the effects that they found, right? So there were treatment effects on executive function, on a measure of attention impulsivity, not quite there for effortful control. I won't go into all of this exactly what it is, but they're related constructs. And also they found effects on children's vocabulary development, their letter naming, and early math skills, right? So this model, this idea of ways we can support self-regulation by supporting emotion and attention should support executive function, and by supporting executive function should help with school readiness. And sure enough, in a mediational analysis of this path, so the far left would be the intervention, the mediator is the executive functions, and then the outcome is the vocabulary, letter naming, and math skills. And so there's a mediated effect here that I won't go into, but it's an important statistical technique that helps us understand the idea that there may be a causal relation among these variables. Certainly the experimental method in this is very important, and we have other examples of these sorts of projects, right? Another that is not designed specifically for the environment of poverty, but I think works, we have some evidence that it works really well with this, that's exclusively, or not exclusively, intentionally focused on executive function development and self-regulation in children, is this Tools of the Mind curriculum, right? So it's developed by two early childhood educators in Colorado, Deborah Leong and Elena Bedrova, and it really focuses on executive function as a way to promote academic outcomes for kids, right, and good social skills for kids. It's based on the Vygotskian approach to early childhood development, if you're familiar with that. And mainly what it is it's structured socio-dramatic play. So children they're planning their play, they're planning who they're going to play with, how they're going to play. They then enter into an extended play bout around a particular theme in which it's high level of make-believe, it's structured make-believe. And that's the main ingredient. There are other aspects of the curriculum, and I'm a pretty poor spokesman for it, to tell you the truth. So you could go online and look for more of this. I've been in the classrooms, and I was just astounded by the focus in the classroom. Kids paying attention. Often you go into an early childhood classroom, and if it's not well run, you're kind of the most interesting thing that's happened in there that day. And kids will sort of follow you around and look for you, and that sort of thing never happens in Tools of the Mind. They look over their shoulder, they see that you're there, they check you out, okay, and then they go back to what they're doing. There's a lot of focus. Actually, there's an interesting, President Obama was in a Tools of the Mind classroom in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago. The link may still be up on CBS News, but he's sitting there with the kids. There's the president, there's like 5 cameramen and security guys, and the teacher's doing a little writing lesson that they do, and all the eyes are focused on the teacher. There's not a kid, I'm serious, it's just amazing, it's astounding. You'd think it was scripted, but there's not a kid looking at him or looking at the security guys or the camera. They're all focused on the eyes on the teacher, who does a great job, by the way. So I think there's a lot of promise for this curriculum. There's some mixed results from these studies, though. Anyway, here's another aspect of the curriculum. These kids are doing a little math, an ordinality math lesson, and they tend to do things in pairs, right? So one kid's the doer of the math lesson, the other kid's the checker of the kid. And many of the activities are like that, done in pairs or small groups. And the idea is you don't want to necessarily have to learn both those roles at the same time. You can learn the doing of the math concept and then learn to check it, do them separately, and then integrate them over time. So that's the idea behind Tools of the Mind. There's been an evaluation of this, a small-scale evaluation, by my colleague at UBC, Adele Diamond. And what Adele found was that there are effects on executive function development. This was a randomized design as well. And this one, she didn't have academic outcomes, but she was able to get them later and found that the more complex executive function tasks, which are these ones on the right, the reverse flanker and the dots mixed, I won't go into those. You can think of them as like really hard peg tapping. They saw big effects on those kids being able to at least do the tasks. And then that ability to do those tasks, the complex task, was pretty highly correlated for the most part with academic outcomes in the kids. Now, subsequently, another team did an evaluation of this Tools of the Mind curriculum in Nashville at Vanderbilt. You may have heard of it. And they found no effects on preschoolers in that curriculum. We have subsequently done one with kindergarten. There's a kindergarten version of this curriculum. It's the same thing. It's play-based, but kids are going to learning centers. It's a different kind of play that they're doing. It's very child-directed. It's very group-oriented, and they're following this plan as they do it. And they play around themes, and they actually play around these themes, the Magic Treehouse books, if you're familiar with those books. And they have a lot of vocabulary in them. Kids learn a lot of vocabulary through these themed play. And what we found was, we found some smaller general effects on math and reading and working memory. We found very big effects, really, in poverty schools. This was a randomized design. We randomized at the school level that included 80 classrooms in 29 schools and about 800 children. We just completed data collection on it the other day for the first grade follow-up. And what we saw was at the end of kindergarten, these are effects of the curriculum in the controlling for baseline ability, effects of the treatment, and we're really encouraged by these findings. And the most encouraging thing was we saw effects on growth in reading into the first grade. That's impressive. These are hard things to change. I'm really, it's the curriculum. I think it's an exceptional curriculum. It has the right idea. It's based on executive function. We don't have the neuroscience behind it. Hopefully we can do some brain imaging. That question came up before. And actually we've been talking to a lab. This study was in Massachusetts, so it had some very low-income schools in Lynn, Massachusetts, and some very high income schools out in the western part of Massachusetts. We saw these big effects in poverty school, and we hope to do some brain imaging through a colleague at MIT, John Gabrielli, to look at some of the effects of tools in the brain. Eventually we'll be able to do that. I'm sure we'll do that. So, and as well, it's not necessarily exclusive to that. I don't want to focus on the curriculum per se, but focus on the approach, right? Focus on self-regulation. As we understand it, we know how to support it. Montessori in an evaluation had very similar effects in, I think these are 5-year-olds and 12-year-olds. So again, we know how to, education is brain training, right? But if you get to school and you're not ready for it, you just fall farther and farther behind. So the way that we need to approach this is to think about it in early childhood, think about parenting, think about its effects on brain development, how best to support it, because we want good outcomes. It's the only way that we can combat income inequality and inequality of opportunity in our country right now. We have to make sure kids are ready for school. We have to do everything we can. Remember Education Goal 1 back in the 90s? Every child would enter school ready to learn. That was the first Bush. We didn't make much progress on that one, but we can. It's still an important goal. So just to wrap up, just to say another way is, of course, to start early, and there are some parenting programs that are out there. The Early Head Start program got very interested in this idea of toxic stress, the idea that poverty is stressful for children, and what we're evaluating in this study is the extent to which a high-quality parenting program in Early Head Start can reduce stress, not only in the child, but in the mother as well. And so we're measuring mom's physiology and mom's executive function in this study, right? So just to wrap up, I think these community efforts, right? Whether we're talking about agencies providing services to families, or we're talking about the best way to structure education and experiences for kids, can recognize multiple manifestations of risk. Physiologically, attention, emotion, so on and so forth. We need to clue into these to promote healthy development. And now what we know about gene expression, the extent to which what's happening in the child physiologically is influencing the expression of genes. We're not talking about the DNA sequence, we're talking about genes getting turned on and off in response to experience in ways that as development becomes more conservative and begins to set up, right? So again, research suggests a focus on stress, but not that stress is inherently bad. The regulation of stress, the moderation. So let kids try things, let kids experience failure. That's okay. You got to deal with that. And overcome it. So, right, in education, I'm big on this, the idea that we can remake education. We talk a lot about failed education in the United States, but I think we have a very good idea. We just need the political will to follow it through. And then finally, these executive functions are dependent on self-regulation, one aspect of a SES-related achievement gap, and a common pathway, right, through which many things affect development. Over time, right? And some more conclusions, but I just want to wrap up there, right? In that we know a lot about how to support children's development and brain development, and I encourage you all to if you have the opportunity to get involved and to do as much as you can in supporting children in your community. And here's many of my collaborators and funders, and thank you so much for having me here and your time and attention tonight, taking time out of your busy schedule on a Thursday night to come and hear about brain awareness. All right.
Oh. Questions for Dr. Blair? Ramin?
I just had a quick question, going back to self-regulation. Is there any evidence that children who naturally self-soothe, like thumbsuckers, actually do better in cognitive testing or school readiness?
That's a great question. We actually have data that addresses that. I showed it today at the earlier meeting. What we do is we scare babies and make them angry and make them cry in our research. We're those people. It's okay. They calm down. They're not permanently scared of masks. But what we saw is we code for how upset the babies become, and then we code for their self-soothing activities, usually avoidance and turning away. And sure enough, at 15 months, the highly reactive kids who showed a lot of regulation do a lot better on executive function at 48 months of age. Kids who are highly reactive and don't show any regulation do the worst. So that all went together the way we expected it to.
So if we're seeing this limbic system that's developing really early on, and then we see, the prefrontal cortex, which is not really coming, to full development until the 20s, then do we focus early on the limbic system in this, emotion regulation, or do we focus on the connectivity between these systems without kind of stressing the prefrontal cortex to develop too soon?
That is a really good question. That I don't know the answer. I hope that you can figure that out for us. If you were a graduate student. If you're not, I encourage you to become one as soon as possible. So what we don't, I think, know as much about is the course of brain metabolism. I'd be very interested in just the amount of energy at the brain at any one time point. I would say, from my standpoint on that, the idea is that the absolute essential thing is to provide an appropriate level of complexity for young children. So in a Vygotskian zone of proximal development sort of thing, if it's too simple, kids won't pay attention, it's boring. If it's too complex, it's confusing, and prefrontal cortex will shut down. So I would say, it's a dual-pronged attack. The optimum would be both the appropriate level of complexity and the support for the limbic system. But if you could only have one or the other, the idea is that their compensatory response could kick in. So that would be the idea.
So, Clancy, I'm trying to tie your talk with the previous talk. Sure. And so this concept of toxic stress, it gets thrown around a lot. These are two words, and they're linked together, and I don't know what it means. So is it toxic stress when it turns off the prefrontal cortex? Or is it toxic stress when, the child sort of decompensate? How would you characterize that?
It's a tricky idea. I think of it in the former way, that it's when the stress physiology is under pressure, is under allostatic load, and it goes to a point, could be low, but usually high, in which it's just not flexibly regulated anymore. And you need to be able to flexibly regulate it and have it track along with behavior rather than be divorced from behavior. That's where I see, but this idea of toxic, it suggests that it may be killing cells. Perhaps it's doing that, but I think of it more as it's causing the certain cells to fire in certain patterns that wire up in ways that are going to shape behavior toward a more reactive mode as opposed to more reflective mode of responding. So I don't know that helped. It probably just added to the confusion, but certainly that's the goal, is to make that clearer, and I think we have a job as a field and as spokespeople to do that.
So going from that, is the better way to think of toxic stress is it's more dependent on the person's or the child's reaction, as opposed to, I think we have a tendency to think of certain kinds of environments to be toxic stress for children, as opposed to thinking about whether the threshold is different according to the child.
That's another very good question, or very good point. And I think when we use toxic stress, we think of like alarms going off and this craziness and chaos, but environments might be just unpredictable. And too complex, alternately too complex and not complex enough. And I would characterize that as toxic stress too. It's not supporting children's development in a way, and that is toxic ultimately to the child, however we begin to define that. But that could be problems with the regulation of attention, the regulation of emotion, and so on and so forth, that really undercuts the kind of goals that we would like to see for children that I listed at the outset.
Thank you.
You mentioned that you had teachers that were willing to give saliva samples.
Yes.
Do you ever have parents that might be willing to give those saliva samples?
We do.
Just thinking that children are completely dependent on their parents, and that environment is certainly not going to, it's always out of the control of the child.
I know.
Life has taught me that parents are often, they're the child's first and best teacher if they know what to do.
That's a good point.
But it's hard if you came from an environment that was toxic, not to repeat the exact same process. So for me, I struggle with, we can do all these wonderful things for the children, but then we have to return them to the toxic, perhaps, environment. That perhaps the focus could shift or include the parent, because in my mind, as long as they're minors, it's a package deal.
I agree.
And to be able to, what wires together, fires together, wires together, it's already wired incorrectly, if you will, in their parent.
Right.
And we don't want to separate children from their parents. All those social issues, it's a big, big, complex. If we could get to the parents, I just feel like they need to be included in almost everything, because they're the success if we want to stop the madness, if you will.
Absolutely, and that is actually, very much a priority right now. So, of course, we've always, as psychologists, as much as possible, focused on the dyad or the triad or however, but, maybe more with lip service than not sometimes. But that's right, measuring sort of physiology in moms, executive function, the ability to regulate emotion and attention, they're exactly the example that children are going to be following. And to complicate things, too, we really need to know intergenerationally, or at least back to adverse early life experiences, giving the potential effects that we've seen in a number of longitudinal studies, that these adverse life experiences have long-term effects. So we can administer questionnaires to parents about that, but of course we don't know. But I think you make a great point, most immediately measuring those things in parents. And that's what our early Head Start study is really focused on.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? I have one for Dr. Fox to maybe relate to this. And my question has to do with the idea of the delayed development of frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex. So what I have understood before is that the long tracks myelination isn't totally complete in the long tracks to the prefrontal cortex until this early age. But is there imaging data from adults that verify that it's not really functioning fully until, say, 21, 22? Or is that kind of data available? When we say that it isn't really fully developed until, say, age 20.
So there are.
Come up.
So Jay Geed has done serial images, functional imaging of young children. I think he started at age 3, and it goes all the way up through age 20. And he shows the changes that occur in neuronal growth and development across that period of time. I don't think it would be right to say that it's not functioning, but I do think that what he does show in those studies is that there are physical changes that are occurring up through age 20, mostly having to do with pruning. So it really has to do with the later changes having to do with cortical thinning, as opposed to the elaboration of connections and synapses.
Thank you.
I have a question for
Paul.
both Dr. Fox and Dr. Blair. So 38126 is one of the poorest areas in Memphis and one of the poorest areas in the country. And if I could go over there and get the parents' attention tell them 3 things, how would you prioritize what I should tell them to do?
I would say the first one for me would be language, language, language. Speak in a lot of positives and minimize the negatives. So speak, 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 sing, 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 speak, speak. Just get that just constant stream of language up to your baby, even though your baby doesn't understand what you're saying. Your baby understands what you're saying. So that would be number one for me.
Let me ask you to expand your question. So if I say three things to a parent, do you mean a parent of a new infant or the parent of children? I mean, because I think that the demands of care, demands of parenting change as kids develop, right? So that's a different thing that I would say to a parent of a 1-year-old than I would say to the parent of a 4-year-old.
No, new infants, yes, right. To protect the child from the stress of poverty.
Oh, that's a tough.
I would say the language, definitely. A lot of talking, a lot of reading to the baby, a lot of talking to the baby, a
Yeah.
lot of language stimulation.
And I would say, new baby, serve and return.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that contingent, responsive, social interaction in a positive way is the most important thing in the first year of life for a baby.
Right, and they would say, attend to your baby's cues, right? So
Right.
where your baby's looking or if your baby's upset, try and need some education to go along with that, but attending to those cues. What are they? And then give some examples of those. I think that's really important. And then it's a borrowed line from a woman named Mary Dozier who has a attachment-focused intervention. One of the watchwords for her intervention is, don't scare your baby. And, you know. Thank you, Hank. I served you that as a softball and you hit it. Yes. So that idea but be very responsive to serve in return.
So can I be as bold to suggest number 3 is touching the baby, a lot of tactile stimulation, because they need to form a body image. And I think a lot of the differences that we see in sort of the Eastern versus Western psychological development is from daily massages and things, and there may be a biological role because nerve growth factor is manufactured in the skin, and it goes up through the afferent nerves into the brain. So, I mean that maybe the third thing is stroke, touch, gentle as your baby as much as you can.
And if I could say one other thing, if it were possible for the parents, for the moms, for the dads, to create the conditions that would reduce their stress, that would be as important, not more important, but as important as all the things that they can do with their baby.
No.
I was just going to say, this is one of our newer publications that we have for agencies and families, and this is the distilled message that we have come up with, which is not to dismiss anything that y'all just said, but we also believe that it's important to be able to communicate things really quickly and solidly and, without too much jargon and language, which is hard to do in our professions that we work in. And so, anyway, I just wanted to plug this because we've been working on this for this idea of getting the word out about touch, talk, read, play for a number of years. And we feel like it's getting some traction. I don't know if any of y'all have heard of it already, but anyway, thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, there's no more we have one more? We can take one more. Go ahead. Paul, right over here.
Hi. I'm a parent of a 5-year-old developmental delayed child. And also, I'm a Head Start teacher as well. So it seems like I'm wearing 2 hats in one. When I noticed that my child was developmentally delayed at the age of 3 and I tried to get her intervention services, they denied her. They stated that it was too late. Due to the prior knowledge that I'm already in the early childhood education field, I'm also in school for my bachelor's in early childhood education with a minor in special ed. I do the language, I do all the positive social interaction and everything. Right now, she's in the public school system with an IEP for autism, ADHD, sensory integration. The list goes on and on and on. She has several therapists. The neurologist, he wants to constantly give her 4 different types of medicine. My problem is, how can she learn or grow if she's constantly medicated? What can I do to improve her status? It's hard to find her a school that will meet her needs. I'm having problems with the teacher in the special ed pre-K. I get calls. So it's like I say, I'm wearing 2 hats in one because I'm a Head Start teacher as well, so I deal with 20 different personalities. I deal with developmental delays. I deal with behaviors. So I'm trying to get much help as possible for my child and someone else's children as well.
I mean, I wish I had some good advice or solid advice for you or help with that, but I think it's the same sorts of things that you want to do in terms of touch, talk, read, play. And I know that that can be more difficult and to find ways to do that, but I think that's the understanding of developmental delay is it's delay, right? It's a slower process. It's going to maybe never get to the exact same place that it would have been otherwise, but there's a developmental progression, and development is so important, and certainly we know that. And I think focusing on aspects of the same sorts of things and finding sort of different ways to do them, perhaps. I wish I had more advice for you on that, but I think it sounds like you are doing those things and will continue to do them.
I just wanted to say, please don't leave out music, because that is so wonderful for children. And in what you were talking about, providing a record player, a CD player for children in underprivileged homes, and some wonderful children's tapes, and verbal as well as musical can go such a long way. And it also soothes children.
Yes.
It stimulates them and soothes them.
Well, you read my mind on that. That was the next thing that I was going to suggest. We're doing a little project with a jazz musician. He works with preschoolers in terms of just teaching them simple rudiments of tempo, dynamics, sound. Being in control of sound is a great thing, and it's a very simple but fun and enjoyable activity that children can take control of. So that might be something to think about for sure.